Our guest today is Dr. Bryer. He's a professor at the School of Public Administration and director of Downtown Community Engaged Scholarships at the University of Central Florida. He's got several books published, and I came across him with an article in the Orlando Sentinel about how we have to learn to talk to each other and build our society. Dr. Bryer, I'm going to put the spotlight on you, and you're welcome to go.
Very good. Thank you, Judy, for the invitation to be here this evening. I'll share my screen in just a moment, but I'll say a few words just to get us started. As Judy said, this is an invitation that came to me after I published an op-ed in the Orlando Sentinel with the same title as the talk for this evening, In the Company of Strangers, which talked about an approach to facilitating or having conversation across people with different values, different backgrounds, different perspectives, divided opinions on divisive public policy issues, and how I implemented this kind of process with one of my courses. I'm a professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Central Florida, and the course that I referenced in this op-ed was the Master of Public Administration capstone course, which is the final class students take before they graduate. Many of our public administration master's students go on to careers in local government, some in state government, some in federal government. A number go into the nonprofit sector, some go into private business. Most of them, I think, stay local, either in Florida or focus on local government elsewhere around the country. And so the object of the course and facilitating the conversations there was to ensure that students left the program and left the course with a strong sense of, one, the opportunities to have civil discourse, civil dialogue across differences, but two, to also be appreciative of the real challenges that exist when you bring people together. It's not enough to just invite a group of strangers into a room to say we're going to talk about racism, or we're going to talk about mask wearing, or we're going to talk about gender identity, or we're going to talk about name your divisive issue of the day. It's not enough to throw open the doors. We have to do it reasonably, rationally, and we have to be prepared. But we can do it. That was the point of the op-ed. So what I want to do in the time we have together today is just to talk a little bit about my work in this space. I've been at UCF since 2007. Before that, I was pursuing my PhD in public administration from the University of Southern California. Since my PhD study days, really back before then, when I was working in my master's work in Washington, D.C., I've always been interested in engaging diverse communities in conversation. This has always been a passion of mine, and it's continued into my academic life. And I'll talk about some of those examples as we go this evening. To begin, though, if everybody can pop open your chat box. I know this is a statewide organization, but I have no real sense of who all is from where in the state, except for Fort Myers, who nicely identifies herself as being from Fort Myers. If you could just type into the chat box where you're from, just so I get a sense of the geographic diversity of the room here today. And we've got a Tampa, Fort Myers, Dunedin. Okay, St. Pete, Tampa. All right. Well,
we also have someone from Costa Rica, but he's not. He's got people at his house, so he couldn't type in the chat box.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you. Good. St. Pete, Clearwater. Okay. So I live actually about halfway between Orlando and Tampa. I live in Polk County, in the Davenport-Haines City area. So in non-pandemic times, that's roughly a 45-minute commute for me to UCF in downtown Orlando, where my office is. But Tampa, again, when we're not in pandemic times, Tampa tends to be more my playground than Orlando for recreation and things like this. So, so I'm out there all the time. Okay, for this, we can unmute your microphone if you want to jump in. You know, the topic of our conversation today is in the company of strangers. The topic is civility. It is lowering the temperature when we have divisive issues that pull us apart when we don't know how to talk to each other. I'd like to hear just a couple of you maybe volunteer why this is an important topic for you and for this group in particular.
Well, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so divisive issues are sort of unavoidable in my line of work. I have to talk about things like evolution. And like I said, I'm in Southern Illinois, and I'm sure Florida is the same way, where you say evolution, you're going to get a lot of people who aren't going to be real happy that you're teaching their good Christian students this topic in their class. And so I have to, well, over the years, I've came up with ways of framing it so that I can sort of communicate with these religious students as well as my non-religious students.
Okay, thanks. And then how successful have you been in framing it?
I mean, pretty good. I mean, basically what I tell them is, I don't care if you believe in evolution, I just want you to understand evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Anybody else?
Well, from my perspective, I'm also the president of our Suncoast Humanist Society as well. And one difficulty that we've had, not just for the present, but for a very long time now, has been recruiting. And it has to do with the fact that there is a substantial amount of ennui in our society. People are reluctant to join organizations. Someone wrote a book once about lonely bowling.
Yeah, Bowling Alone. Bob Putnam. Mm-hmm.
Sorry?
Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone.
Yes, Bowling Alone, that was it. And at any rate, it's very difficult to stimulate people to take an interest in things, to stimulate curiosity. And people, well, of course, a lot of people are retired in this area, and consequently, they've kind of retired from life as well as from their work in many cases. But when you consider that there are 3 million people in the Tampa Bay area, and that we can only reliably count on maybe 30 to come to any given humanist meeting or atheist meeting or anything else. So it's a discouragingly small enterprise in all cases. So we're always looking for ways in which to try and break out, to make contact, to encounter the stranger more successfully.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. And to do so, I assume without conflict, right? Not to grab attention through creating noise or making noise, but to attract people.
We're not into we're not into self-immolation as a
right.
recruiting tactic. No.
Bill, I see you have your microphone unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yes, I would say that every now and then I accidentally fall out of my bubble. And when I do, it is very challenging to engage people who aren't inside my bubble. And it's very interesting to think about some of the techniques that could be used to at least open a dialogue. Even if it can't go very far, at least you can make a little progress before people start screaming at each other.
Right. Yeah. No, that's always the goal, and the reaction that we have in much of our conversations in our communities today is the first reaction is screaming, where the first reaction is an emotional knee-jerk reaction to something with which we disagree. It's not to approach through curiosity. It's to approach through through hostility, and that's something that we need to move away from. Oh, this is helpful. So if you have other thoughts, feel free to type them into the chat as we go, as Judy said. Or if you have a real burning question as I talk in the next few minutes, feel free to unmute yourself. I'm pretty lax on these Zoom things until people give me a reason not to be lax. So we're good to go with that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for the next bit here. Do you all see my screen? Give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay, excellent, perfect. All right. I always like to start when I give workshops or when I talk to groups about disagreements. I love this, the TV show The Office. The original British version was better than the American version, in my opinion, but the American version was great. Steve Carell starring as the boss in The Office. And there's one episode which you can go later on or now, if you're bored by what I'm saying, go onto Google and type in The Office conflict management episode. And then you should be able to pull up a clip on YouTube of this particular episode, which centers on this poster. One employee in the office hangs this poster on his or her desk in her cubicle, and someone, a colleague, walks past and says, "Take that down. That is an offensive poster. It's exploiting the children. It is harsh commentary on what we value in society." And the person who hung it said, "No, it's adorable. Look, it's art. It's beautiful. It's celebrating children." And the response is, "No, it's offensive. It's the opposite of art." And this is how conflicts happen. So the boss, Steve Carell, comes into the situation and says, "Oh, slow down. Let's cool the temperature a little bit. We're going to create a win-win-win situation in typical conflict management terms. A win for the person who thinks it's adorable, a win for the person who thinks it's offensive, and a win for the moderator, Steve Carell." And his compromise proposal is put the poster up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, take it down on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Well, clearly that's not a good solution to the problem, right? What is a better solution? How do you have that conversation? Well, maybe you say something like, "Well, why do you think it's offensive? Why do you think it's adorable? What kind of art would you think is appropriate that meets both of your definitions of tastefulness," or something like this. So you engage in conversation about the value and the meaning of art, where everybody can move and have some dialogue. But that's not how the Office plays out, of course. It's a funny clip. I encourage you to look at it for a good laugh later this evening or whenever you get the time. And so that's always how I like to start. It's something we can keep in mind as we go. If you can get your virtual hands ready on your reactions tab to show me, let me pull up my reactions tab too. If you can tell me, answer your question, how many, or actually use the chat box, don't use your reactions tab. Use the chat box and type in A, B, C, or D, depending on which statement you agree with most. If a stranger passes you on the street and greets you with a big smile, do you A, smile awkwardly and give a half wave in return? Do you B, respond with a full-throated greeting? Do you C, turn and see to whom this person is talking? Or D, do you cross the other side of the street as quickly as possible while checking your wallet is still in your pocket? Okay, we've got a lot of B's, a lot of friendly people in this group. Okay, some A's, some hesitant greeters, A's and B's. A's and B's, A or B, depending on who knows what, maybe where the person is, what the setting is. Is it outside your home? Is it on the city street? Okay, A's and B's. For me personally, I would probably do a B or a C, depending on the context, right? If I'm on a busy city street, I might do C first. I might turn around and say, who are you talking to? Okay, That's good to know. A or B? Let's try another one. If a stranger in a cafe, and then think about pre-pandemic times when we're sitting in cafes together. If a stranger in a cafe sees you reading a newspaper about a hot topic public policy issue and interrupts you to express an opinion, do you A, perk up, offer a chair, and engage the person in conversation? Do you B, respond by saying, huh, and then turn the page of the paper and pretend to get a call on your cell phone? Do you C, respond with a few symbolic words and gestures but move quickly to the end of the conversation? Or D, do you leave the cafe and check your wallet? We've got a couple of C's, A's. Yeah, we've got some friendly people in the room here. I want to believe I would do A. Thanks for that honesty. Respond with a few symbolic words. So A and C seems to be the popular. Okay. Yeah, this is always a good test, A or D, depending on what the cafe is and all that. Okay. It's always a good test for how we might react to strangers. How would we react if someone interrupts us? Okay, let's do a small variation on the same scenario. If a stranger walks in a cafe wearing a t-shirt of an opposing political candidate or a cause and sees you reading a newspaper about a hot topic and interrupts you to express an opinion, do you, same options. A, perk up. B, respond by saying, huh? C, respond with a few symbolic. Or D, leave the cafe and check your wallet, your phone, and so on. Or you can say in Lithuanian that you don't speak English. All right, depends on their approach. Punch them in the face, okay, always an option, I guess. Depends on the variables, party, issue, demeanor, depends on what the t-shirt says. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of, as we could spin on this for quite a while, things that might make us more welcoming or less welcoming. If there are signs that the stranger might be opposed to us, to our values, to our views, we might be a little bit more hesitant. That's pretty common. You know, and when we talk about strangers, we don't have to really go very far. If we look at the data on how we know each other in our communities, we can see, you know, referring to Jim mentioned Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone, this idea, we don't really have connections with each other. We are, in fact, bowling alone. We're not joining organizations. But it's not just not joining organizations. We are less likely today than we were in the past to know who our neighbors are, to certainly know our neighbors by name, to work with our neighbors to solve community problems. The level of empathy that exists in our society has been declining, particularly among the youngest population over the past few decades, where empathy it's not just a question of sympathy, of feeling bad. It's a feeling of not being able to actively imagine walking in someone else's shoes. That has declined over the past few decades, according to research from University of Michigan. The one kind of empathy that's been increasing, or at least holding steady, has been what we can call a bit of a self-interested empathy, where I might be willing to help someone in need, not because I feel their pain, to borrow a phrase from Bill Clinton, but because I would feel guilty if I don't help them. And to relieve my self-interested guilt, I'll take the time to do something. So we've got these data that say we're not connected to each other, we don't empathize with each other. We are in a situation where we don't trust each other. We don't trust the political wisdoms of our neighbors or the people who live around us. We see conspiracy theories, or people who believe in conspiracy theories, all around us. It's just that we really have a pretty negative view of each other as a society. and part of it is because we don't really talk to each other. There's an anecdote I share sometimes from here in the Orlando area. I was giving a workshop in a community and reciting some of these same kinds of statistics. A woman stood up and said, you know, I appreciate this idea of not knowing the neighbor. And she told how she was out on her front porch one day and she saw someone across the way collapsed on his front porch. She went over and she wasn't breathing, maybe suffered her heart. She called 911 and the 911 operator asked, okay, where are you? What's the address? What's the person's name? And she said, I don't know his name. Someone who lived right across the street from her for years didn't know the name. That's indicative of the lack of relations that we have with each other and something that that leads to the lack of civility that we have in our communities. So my work is focused on building these relationships, on building what I like to call civically healthy communities. I am a public administration scholar in the School of Public Administration. The work that has guided me somewhat, or the ideas that have guided me somewhat, are captured very well by in a recent book by David Matthews, who's the president and CEO of an organization called the Kettering Foundation. And I'd encourage you to look at their website, kettering.org. The book is called With the People. And what Dr. Matthews does is play on the words of Abraham Lincoln, who famously in the Gettysburg Address declared that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, which are all nice, good, noble ideas. But what Matthews asks is that enough to have government of, by, and for the people? If we really want to strengthen our communities and strengthen our society, should we instead be talking about government with the people? Add a different preposition. Rather than of, by, and for, let's talk about government with the people. And one of the ideas that is embedded in Matthew's text is this pretty simple notion that if we are disappointed in how our government officials and our elected officials are treating each other, that we see government is not getting along well with, and that government officials are not getting along well, that our government is not progressing on issues that are important for all of our communities, individually or collectively. The reason is not just the failure of government, it is a failure of the citizens. If we want a government that works well, we need citizens that work well together in the same way. And this is where I start a lot of my work. The way I frame it is, as we saw in this last presidential election, we can be very strong in ballot box democracy, though of course we have challenges to that with some of the legislation that's passing through some states now, challenging the openness of the ballot, and openness of voting. But we have demonstrated we can be strong in ballot box democracy, but we are really weak in neighborhood democracy. We're really weak when it comes to knowing the other, knowing people who are not like us. And in fact, we sometimes take pains to not want to know people who are somehow not like us. Okay. And so Joe Biden gave a talk where the rhetoric rang kind of true for me, and I know for others who research in this area during his State of the Union talk. And this is a quote from the State of the Union. He said from the bottom first, history, faith, and reason show the way of unity. We can see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors. We can see each other with the dignity and respect. We can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature. For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury, no progress, only exhausting outreach, no nation, only a state of chaos. And he asked in this speech, I know speaking of unity can sound to some like a foolish fantasy, but he answers, it might be, but it's not. Now, I'm not here to endorse Joe Biden's approach. We can debate, and others can debate in a civil way, whether or not Joe Biden is acting as a unifying force or if he's not. But these words are powerful words that suggest an ideal and a potential for what we can achieve across our communities. Not on a national scale all at once. So we can't have the President of the United States declare we will start loving each other, get ready. That's not going to happen. When we talk about civility and changing the culture of our communities and neighborhoods and politics, we have to start at the most local of levels, the neighborhood, the membership organization like this organization, associations that exist throughout society, and so on. And then consistent with what Joe Biden talked about in his State of the Union address, is we can find research on this idea of civility itself. President Biden asked whether or not unity is a foolish fantasy. Well, there are those who suggest this idea of civility and all the talk of wanting to have civility is something of a sucker's fantasy that we have to be wary of, maybe being a bit naive when we talk about pushing or promoting civility. For instance, from philosophical considerations, some would consider civility and niceness as a counterfeit virtue. It's easy to, in other words, it's easy to fake being nice. It's easy to fake putting on a smile, like I offered in the questions at the start of this slide deck. It's easy to smile at someone if they, or half-heartedly smile at someone, or to half-heartedly respond to someone if they comment to you as you're reading the newspaper. That's a counterfeit virtue. You're not being civil and you're not being nice in order to promote unity. You're not being civil and not being nice in order to promote togetherness and cohesiveness and community. You're being civil and you're being nice in order to deceive and get out of the situation as quickly as possible. You don't want to create chaos, but you don't want to get stuck in something you don't want to be a part of either. So there is a possibility that civility and niceness are in fact something that can be faked, and they are in fact a deception. In the same way, civility and niceness can be seen as just going through the motions, which is called a semblance of virtue, not an actual virtue. But on the other hand, we again see promise, and this is where my work is, civility as civic and political equality. If we want a civil community, if we want to have strangers working well together, citizens working well together so that our government can work better together on behalf of and with citizens, then we need to focus on other virtues, not of civility and niceness as such, but justice, fairness, and equity. And this is where a lot of the work points us. And so, and I see some questions popping up in the chat. Keep them coming, and I'll while they're fresh on your mind, and I'll route back to them after I'm done with the slide deck here. My own work has been influenced by several philosophers and thought leaders over the years. Martin Buber talked about the I-thou relationship versus the I-it relationship. I-it suggests that we relate to each other in a transactional sense. We treat each other as objects rather than fellow humans. I-thou is an idea that we are all human, and we have to treat each other in that human way, not as objects to be manipulated if we want to progress as a society. In similar fashion, Amitay Etzioni, a communitarian philosopher, talks about the I and we relationship. The strong society is one where we recognize the individuality of everybody, but also recognize the importance of collectiveness for everybody. And we only succeed when we recognize both as necessary, but also both as needing protection in our political discourse. We have this idea that the boundaries of we, in that sense, are continually shifting, particularly in our society, where our diversity is increasing. Our demographic diversity is racial, ethnic diversity is changing on a regular basis. When we talk about gender identities, those boundaries are shifting on a regular basis, and how we interact with different identities. All of that is shifting, and we have to recognize that, which challenges us time and again to think of breaking down whatever walls might separate us. And then we can always go back to, for those of you who maybe think back to your political science 101 courses, if you ever took one at some point in time, Alexis de Tocqueville in the book Democracy in America talked about this idea of self-interest rightly understood, where he argues that the success of 19th century United States was not because of the self-interested selfishness of individuals and their ingenuity and entrepreneurship. It was because people saw each other's self-interest as only possible when others' self-interests are also met. My self-interest depends on your self-interest. We succeed together only if we both succeed. If one of us fails, we both fail. Self-interest rightly understood is the basic idea there. And so my work has led me to a set of principles, and they might be a little bit provocative, maybe so, I hope so. But these are principles that I've been working through and adapting over the years that seem to make sense when we talk about civility and bringing strangers together. One, we need a system in our society, a political system, a civil society system, whatever the case might be, that is grounded not in the idea of trust. There are a lot of folks who say we just need to learn to trust each other. This is where I kind of hit headlong into reality to say we're never going to get to a point where we trust each other. It's just not going to happen. And so I prefer a system based on, we're talking about a system based on skepticism, or trust but verify, as we might hear in other channels. Skepticism. We believe you, we trust you, we trust you to a point, but we're going to be wary of your actions, of your motivations. If you appear to be civil and nice, I don't want to be deceived by your appearance. I want to verify that you are in fact interested in coming genuinely to the conversation. That's the idea there. We want to have an assumption of ignorance, not ill intent. This idea has gotten a lot of good people into trouble in the past several years, particularly with social media these days. I'm always wary as an academic who does a lot of lectures, and I talk for a living, so inevitably I'm going to say something that's going to be misinterpreted and maybe get me into hot water, right? And particularly when it's being recorded and going to be placed on YouTube. My God, I'm shaking in my boots right now. But we have this assumption of ignorance as critical for civility in our society. That if we are offended by something, our first reaction ought to be that the person who offended did not intend to offend. So we have to call out the offense and educate, rather than, particularly in this day and age, take a snippet of the talk, take a snippet of the article, take a snippet of the soundbite, post it on social media and say this person is an X, Y, and Z, right? Let's assume that there is ignorance first, try to educate about why that it is offensive. That's how we develop empathy. If we assume first ill intent, then we stop the conversation right there. We freeze people from wanting to engage in conversation about difficult issues because we will be afraid to offend each other, right? This is the worst possible thing that can happen. If we're afraid of insulting, if we're afraid of offending, if we're afraid of getting in trouble because of something we say, despite our intention, then we will never be able to bring a representative group of people together to engage in conversation, group of strangers together or otherwise. We have to engage based on curiosity, not on commitment. curiosity to learn, not a commitment to adapt our views or change our views based on what others say. A system based on struggle, not compromise, which means compromise is a cop-out. Putting the poster up of the children playing musical instruments as like the Blues Brothers, that's not, that's compromise. That's an easy way out. It's a cop-out. It denies the opportunity to struggle through difficult conversation. We only make progress when we take the time, suffer the aggravation, suffer the internal turmoil about our values and beliefs and truths in order to develop that empathy and then reach a better place together. Focus on individualism, not collectivism. This is important as we recognize the uniqueness of every individual, and we don't assume anybody as adhering to one set of values because they look like, sound like, or otherwise are appear like another group. Focus on shared geography, not shared values, and which is important as I think about it. You know, there are some of my colleagues in this area talk about the importance of starting with shared values and in conversation. What do we agree on, and start from there. We can do that, but at the same time, I'm a bit of a pragmatist when it comes to these issues. To say, let's not. Maybe we share some values, maybe we do, and they might be something somewhat related to the divisive issue that we're talking about, maybe not. But let's just start with what we do know. We live together. We live in the same geographic area. We live in the same zip code. We live in the same neighborhood. We live in the same state. We live in the same country. Let's start there and say, how can we X, Y, and Z or progress in a way that's desirable for everybody? And then lastly, a goal of mutual empathy rather than shared purpose. And that's consistent with the previous. The goal is to understand, not to persuade, not to convince, so forth and so on. Okay, so I'm gonna bounce on, and I might hasten my speed a little bit just to get to some questions, as I see some that are out there, and I'm sure there are others. I started just this past Friday a series of public conversations that were like the ones that I wrote about in the op-ed in the Orlando Sentinel. Last semester, with my Master's of Public Administration students, I facilitated public conversations on Zoom about institutional racism in public service delivery. These were Zoom-based open conversations that my students were required to participate unless they had some reason why they couldn't, work or otherwise. But then it was wide open for anybody to join. So we had about 70, 80, 90 or so people participate in each of the conversations about racism last semester. This semester, starting this past Friday and for the next 2 Fridays on April 2nd and 9th, I have a series of public conversations about COVID-19 vaccine participation, another divisive issue. The one that we just had this past Friday, we had a blend of folks, some saying that they are really not at all likely to get the vaccine, and these are the reasons why. We had others say, we're eager to get the vaccine, here are the reasons why. This is why we think it's good for us, or this is why it's not making us comfortable, whatever it might be. We're going to continue those conversations, and I encourage you to go to this URL, and if you're interested, to join. They're at 12 p.m. on each of those days for 1 hour, and so you can join the conversation, or you can sit back and see how I do this stuff in practice, if you just want to sit and observe my approach. So with that, I'm a little curious if you want to type into the chat box here. If you were to ask the question, as this is kind of a divisive issue of the day, we know that we have approximately 30% of the population in the United States that have received a vaccine, at least one, or have received both. I just received my second shot today. So we know we've got about 30% of the adult population that have received the vaccine or on their way to being fully vaccinated. We need to get to a point of 70 to 80 or 85% to have herd immunity. So we've got a long way to go in our society. And so the question is that we're asking in these public conversations, why are some individuals hesitant to receive the vaccine? So you can either type into the chat or you can unmute yourself. How would you ask the question? If you were to, and I should say I had 129 people registered for this thing on Friday. I had about 90 show up, which is a very respectable number. 90 people showed up. About 30 of them were my students, so 60 strangers from who knows where coming in to join the conversation. How would you ask the question? So we have one asking, I want to understand how you came to the position to not get a vaccine. Okay. Other ideas? You can feel free to unmute yourself if you want.
Well, the attitude of many people, it seems to me, is based on the anti-vaxxer position, which has obtained for quite a few people over the last 15 or 20 years since it's been out there. It was originally created by a physician in Great Britain who advanced the notion that there's something harmful about it. But it's been taken up by a good many of the conspiracy theorists whose ideas seem to be highly prevalent now. And it seems to me betokens a distinct lack of trust in our predominant institutions, education, government, and so forth. This has been stoked, I think, for a long time politically by people who have some sort of notion in mind of creating a revolution, some sort of a situation by which they can overturn a government which they see as hostile. And it's based on pure nonsense, but there it is.
I think a lot of it has to do with the anti-expert and the anti-science situation that exists in our society. People do not trust scientists anymore for some bizarre reason. I mean, there's good reason for some people not to trust them in some parts of our society, and I think we need to make sure that we're asking the right questions there and that we do have reliable information, a consensus among the scientific community. I don't want to drink bleach, thank you very much, even though some doctor might say it's okay. But there seems to be a great deal of anti-science sentiment in our countries.
Well, you're asking how to ask the question, right?
Right. Yeah. So if you've got a group of people in front of you, some of whom are hesitant, some of whom are not, you want to know why are people hesitant to get the vaccine. So you're suggesting the question
as open-ended as possible, because I mean, the one thing you don't want to do is you're not trying to impose your views on them. So you're going to want to make sure that you're giving them the opportunity to express their views and not just to agree or disagree with your view.
Yeah.
I keep hoping that I'm going to ask the right question and they're going to see the light. I know that's naive, but I keep hoping that.
Yeah, you know, it's not so naive. There's a method that's used that's known as motivational interviewing that allows you to basically do that, asking the right question, not with the intent to change minds exactly, but to help illuminate and then to educate by asking questions. It's just like a doctor would ask, or the guys on Car Talk, which I loved until it was not on. But you know, you ask questions until you get the person to say, "Aha, that's what the answer is," right? You know, so allow them to come to the realization. So it is possible. So Pam is saying, "Have you ever received a vaccine? And if so, did that experience influence your willingness to be vaccinated for COVID? If you have never been vaccinated in your life, how does the seriousness address it?" We had a few come in. So yeah, so we've got so I asked the questions in the first conversation this past week on two levels. One, I first thought about asking it, Michael, in the same way that you suggested. Very simply, why are you hesitant to get it, or what are the reasons why you are hesitant to get it? But then I thought a little better of it. And thought that might actually be a bit too hard for some people. It pushes them into a corner and says, you are part of the group who are classified as hesitant. and that automatically creates a group, maybe an in-group and an out-group, maybe puts a spotlight on them, and within the broader group, which can create stereotypes. It can push people apart. So I backed up a little bit, and I used two questions. One, what have you heard about the COVID-19 vaccine that gives you comfort or makes you feel okay about it? And what are the sources of information where you've got where you've gotten that information? And the second, what have you heard about the vaccine that gives you concerns? And what are the sources, right? So it's a softer approach without putting anybody into a box, because even those who are getting in line to get a vaccine still might have concerns, right? And then so it creates an openness where everybody can feel like they can share without putting anybody into a box. And importantly, I see some language in the chat box, and we can talk about the rise of the anti-vaxxer efforts from with respect to the some of those childhood vaccines, and so we want to avoid labels at the same time. Avoid use of the term. And I told my students, do not utter the phrase conspiracy theorist. Do not talk about anti-vaxxer. Why? These are things that put boxes around people. They define people. They label people in a way that creates stereotypes and visions. It's just, I would imagine, just speaking openly now, if someone were to go to this group and hear the word atheist, immediately reactions come into play, right? And people will start treating you differently because of that label. It's the same thing whether we are talking about Democrat, Republican, Blue Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, anti-vaxxer, not anti-vaxxer, anti-masker, pro-mask, whatever. Any way that we label people creates division, and that's where we want to avoid, particularly when we start these conversations. Labels can come and they'll drift in as we go in conversation, but to start like that can be a bit problematic. And so framing the question is very important to avoid those boxes. I start my conversations with a set of ground rules, which are listed here. One is to listen to other voices, emphasizing that listening is as important as speaking. And so we have to keep that in mind. Two, consider each idea fairly, looking at its benefits and its trade-offs. Three, recognizing that everyone is encouraged to participate. The way I like to talk about it is encourage civility, not timidity. We want everybody to express themselves, but to do it in a way that is not offensive, intentionally offensive to others. It's okay to disagree, but to do so with curiosity, not hostility. Keep an open mind. There you go. There's civility, not timidity. I already talked about the ignorance warning before. That's something I raise at the top of any of these kinds of dialogues. And then the no labels rule, that we want to avoid those labels in these kinds of dialogues and conversations. I'd encourage you, I'll jump past this. These are just some quotes from participants from last semester with my students who were talking about racism. Just overall, great feedback of what they experienced, what they learned, how it was. Someone reported that somebody in their conversation, their small group, might recognize that they might be part of the problem. It's like, wow, that's huge for someone to openly admit that in a public setting. So these kinds of ideas, humbling is a phrase that's appeared here. So there are benefits to these conversations. They open up possibilities. I'd encourage you to look at a website for an organization called the National Issues Forum, nifi.org. They have a set of issue guides on a variety of complicated and divisive issues in our society. This is a very broad one about how we would actually set up our political system to make it better, whether we talk about campaign finance reform or regulations or speech regulations or all kinds of other possibilities. But what's nice about the National Issues Forum, they take these complex issues, they break them down, not into a pro-con of what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks of possible courses of action, but they say for every possible option that we have, for instance, to reduce dangerous, toxic talk in our community, there is a possible drawback or trade-off. Someone, somewhere, some demographic or population in our society will have to sacrifice or suffer because of this action taken. And so these guides do a nice job of framing the issue in a way that is not labeling, that is that encourages people to talk with each other across all of the possibilities, recognize what the drawbacks and threats are if we adopt any particular action. I'd encourage anybody in this group, either as part of one of your meetings, or if in any other part of your life, if you have another organization, browse through, pick up an issue topic, and have a conversation around it. I gave a talk like this to the Central Florida Commission on Religious Freedom, doing something like this in partnership with them, bringing all those other faith organizations together to have a conversation about how to create a more perfect society from a political perspective. That would be a fun and interesting dialogue to have if you brought all of these different religious organizations and other membership organizations together to engage in dialogue to understand the benefits and the drawbacks. And then I'll close just by saying it's not just about talk. We've talked, our conversation here so far has been about talking, dialogue, conversations. But my experience is that if we truly want to bridge our division, we need action. We need shared experience, not just shared dialogue. And here is where we can look at joint volunteer initiatives. For instance, if your association were to join forces with other associations with very different memberships and very different demographics served, and to say, hey, let's all pick a day and go to the local food bank to volunteer on this day once a month or a couple times a year or whatever the case may be. That shared experience is more powerful in building relationship than sitting around a table or a Zoom room and having conversation.
If I might interrupt, we have tried that a few times, not consistently, and we've been rejected every time. They don't want atheists involved, period.
Yeah. Well,
now it's been a couple of years, so maybe there's some new people involved that are more open, and I could try it again. But that has been our experience. We tried to give pet food to homeless people through the local food, the restaurants, not restaurants, feeding the homeless kind of thing. They refused.
Right.
They didn't want it. Didn't want atheists involved.
Well, and that's maybe not entirely unique. I don't know who you asked or how you asked, but for even those faith organizations that have these ministries doing all of this work in communities tends not to want to coordinate with each other. So it's not just, it might not just be atheists. It could be, this is our ministry, this is our volunteer initiative for our members. We want to do it alone because it's part of our mission in our community. And there's a phrase that I like to use there. A lot of faith organizations are denominationally divided, right? They all share purpose, but they are not joined together in action. And it's an organizational reality. But there are groups that try to bridge that, and I'm encouraged by this new Central Florida Commission on Religious Freedom. I think Jim Coffin, I think, is just a great guy in my experience who would probably go to bat and help to organize something. Same I think with I'm blanking on his name now, which is horrible. The former pastor, Joel Hunter, former pastor at Northland Church here in the Orlando area. one of those big mega churches. He's someone who's a good bridge builder, who would be maybe willing to step up and help, and then look to groups like this, the university as well. We can serve a purpose of helping to bring groups together for conversation. We can be that convening body. That's one power of higher ed. We're kind of neutral in things, generally speaking. So treat us as a convening body if you're interested in that. Sorry, there you go. And
sorry to interrupt again, but which specific public administration would be a good place to start? We have two universities here, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, at the University of South Florida, I can, if we can follow up on email, I can suggest a couple of people I know over there.
Great.
Be of support. Mm-hmm. But that's where I would close, to say, you start with the dialogue, start with the conversation. That's not the end. You want to look for those shared experiences, but there are also non-faith related organizations that you could potentially partner with. I know the League of Women Voters is usually interested in joining forces with other groups on different causes. But yeah, I think there's if there is hesitancy to unite, at least occasionally, for some shared experience, I think part of the reason you might have hesitancy generally to join forces is not a opposition to the Atheists of Florida as such, but just a desire to have their own programming and their own missions for the purpose of serving the homeless, or feeding the homeless, or cleaning the environment, or whatever the case may be. So it's mission focused on the act rather than collaborating and building unity. But if you frame it as, we want to help serve the homeless alongside you, maybe frame it as, we want to help bridge the divides in our communities, right? And this is one way that we think we can do it, by serving together once every couple of months in a volunteer project, right? So frame the act together, right? So with that, I guess I close, because I see quite a few questions, and I'll do my best to jump through them all. But I see hands starting to pop up too. So I'll hand. And then I'll go back through the chat as well if need be.
Okay.
So we'll start with James, then Jim, then Andrea.
Okay, I'd like to just interject the reality of the attempt or the effort to work with theists on anything is extremely a hard mountain to climb. And the reason is the people whom we need to be able to reach are actively taught that they should not interact with atheists, that they should not trust atheists, that atheists are evil, that we are satanic, and as a result of that, they do not want to work with us or even communicate with us. The instant that they find out that you are an atheist, they're on the offense. They're hostile. They're on the defense. They're hostile to anything that you have to say. And this is an extraordinary challenge. As long as they think that they have a chance to convert you, they're more than happy to talk to you. So if you approach them and say, well, I'm an agnostic, I just have questions, I haven't made up my mind, then they are willing to talk with you, but they want to do the talking. They want you to do the listening. And if you attempt to make points, then they come to realize that you are not receptive to their information, then they will abandon the conversation and run away immediately. So it's a very difficult. It's very difficult to communicate with them. I do communicate with them to some level on YouTube by challenging their ethical standards. And then they have to defend their ethical standards, and they want to be able to say that their ethical standards are better, supreme to any secular moral or ethical standards. And so you can suck them into a conversation about ethics. But as far as the dogma, I've pretty much gotten to a point where I don't talk too much about religious dogma. I try to stay away from it because they will run the moment you challenge them. And
Thank you,
of course
Jim.
they have, you're welcome.
Dr. Bryer, did you want to respond in any way to his comments?
Sure. Well, so I'd be interested in what the purpose of the conversations is with those of faith.
Okay, I'll give you that in 30 seconds or less. The point of trying to engage them is to get them to think for themselves, to think critically about what they believe, especially in with respect to ethics and morality.
Yeah. Okay. So engaging in a conversation where you want to have a meaningful dialogue about the root of a belief system, about the root of values, requires, and I'm not going to, I have never heard one of your conversations with anybody, so I can't say what happens in the discussions or not, but it requires the shared dialogue and the shared conversation and the willingness to explore and self-criticize and be open to being criticized at the same time. So that's not an easy thing to do. So if the intent is to encourage people to think critically about their belief system, the conversation has to start from a place with an assumption that they have thought about it. It might be that they've thought about it through their family upbringing. It could be they've thought about it through deep and meaningful conversations with their faith leader. It could, there's any number of possible influences that lead someone to think and to question. Now, most people who are of faith, I would suspect, I haven't seen statistics on this, but most people of faith, I suspect, were born into the faith where they are still a member and they are still practicing if they are practicing. There's not much moving into and out of different faith traditions for the faithful. I'm kind of unique in some way. I was born and raised in the Roman Catholic faith, and then I went off to college and I started. I joined a Unitarian Universalist group, and I moved to Los Angeles, and I ended up in the Methodist Church, and then I met my soon-to-be bride, and stayed in the Methodist Church, and then we found our way back to the Roman Catholic Church, but we're not really practicing, and with the pandemic, we haven't been in, for a while. And so I've been someone who has, and then I can throw in a girl I dated in high school who's a born-again Christian, if you want to talk about an additional influence. So I'm someone who has sort of moved around different faith perspectives and traditions, and I've been able to think about what fits, what doesn't fit, and what values fit my life and what values don't fit my life. So that's really the heart of it. A lot of these conversations on faith are values conversations, and to challenge someone to think critically suggests that they might not be already thinking critically or have not, and so starting from a different posture could be useful. But I would also just generally suggest starting with a different topic. Start engage on other issues that might be influenced by religious faith or not, but are not about the faith itself. So you gain comfort and trust in talking with each other.
Engage them with respect to racism or homophobia, for example, and they identify as Christians, and their doctrines teach that gays and the LGBTQ community are evil, and also they seem to be hugely racist, prejudiced against immigrants and blacks and what have you. And I engage them by challenging them with the ethic that we must not subject people who are different to malevolent treatment that we ourselves do not wish to be subjected to. Now, this is a fundamental foundation of ethics, and yet they are actively seeking to damage people's lives by negative stereotyping, scapegoating, and dehumanizing them. And
But
so
Jim,
I challenge them.
I think what's going on here is what Dr. Bryer is talking about is something completely different than what you're trying to address.
Yeah.
He's talking about building a civil community on a different kind of basis than confronting someone about their belief system. So I don't think I think we're talking at cross purposes here.
Yeah, maybe, but I think it would be even in the individual or collective perspective. Then we'll move on because there are a lot of hands up.
Yes.
But achieving an understanding of the root of the value systems and the root of the ethics would be helpful. Because I think if we look around, folks are set in their positions, and to your point, maybe without critically thinking about those positions because they haven't explored other options or pathways or alternatives. So starting with that understanding, starting with that empathy, and then moving into the more difficult space. But here, I mean, there's no magic bullet on something like this. These are intractable issues where people are socialized into their beliefs. We all are socialized into our beliefs. And so breaking that socialization, we're motivating someone to think about a different socialization is difficult. So I agree. It's a tough nut to crack on that sense. So, but there are other hands. So let's go. I forget who I said. I think
Andrea's next. Jim lowered his hand. So.
Okay, then Andrea.
Hi. Your presentation really hit home today. I was just talking to the members before you came on about how I had an argument again with my brother about, this time it was about the Georgia new Voting Rights Act, and he and I disagreed on that because I felt that he started with the wrong premise to even argue about. And so, and after that, then it turned into a nasty email back and forth. So I would really like to have the knowledge of how to start a conversation with somebody who has such, I can't think of a good adjective, it's just such a different view that I have. I'm coming from I think I'm coming from the character of a person, it was politics, and he's coming from policies. And when he starts out with the wrong premise, like there was a whole lot of illegal voting in the last election. I don't know what to respond to that. I mean, he's already started with something that is wrong.
Right.
How would you have handled that or answered his question?
Yeah, that's well. The first is to investigate and learn why that perspective is held, and that can be done through some conversation. So did he develop his perspective based on some direct observation? Did he develop his perspective based on watching certain news media or following certain social media personality? So what is the source of the information?
What is the source? Right.
That would be one thing that would be important. But then with something like voting rights, that's something where we can, I know I sort of shot away this idea of talking about shared values, but this is something where we can actually talk about shared values in our democratic system. So, you know, those, and I'm gonna throw labels down because they're generally accurate, not exclusively, but for the sake of argument and simplicity here. There are members of the Republican Party who are saying these reforms are necessary to preserve the integrity of elections and to preserve the integrity of democracy, and that's their pitch. That's their framing of the issue, integrity as the important piece. So you can maybe agree, actually, that the integrity of the vote is vitally important. So let's stop there, settle that. How do we define integrity? And are we defining it in the same way? Okay, let's move towards that shared definition, and then move on to some other core values. One person, one vote. The non-coercion of the vote. Then, you know, there are certain things that you might agree on. But then there are some other things other values that might be introduced where you actually have legitimate disagreements. You're just talking out loud, which may or may not be true in this person's case. He might say, I believe the person who's voting, we actually heard a member of some state legislature say this, or maybe it was Congress, I remember, say, we need to make sure that all the people who are voting are educated, right? And that they know on what they're voting about, right? This is for years I've been using a class exercise on this very point. I drafted a resolution where as a baseline for students to have some debate about making sure voters are informed about the issues before they vote, and that it would be the responsibility of government or nonprofit organizations or others to provide that education to make sure citizens are well informed. But that's something that is going to be a divisive issue, right? What does that actually mean? But then at least you can understand where the heart of the conflict is, and move on from there to consider, you know, factual arguments are usually not going to work in a situation like this, right? Historical arguments are not going to work in a situation like this. So you've got to push a little bit just to maybe say, okay, sort of a motivational interviewing kind of technique. Okay, so you believe that a voter has to be fully educated on all the issues to vote. Okay, let's explore that. What do you know about transportation funding? Okay, tell me about that. And, you know, go issue by issue by issue, and then there's a realization eventually that says, you know something, I don't know a heck of a lot about this issue. But yes, I think I should still be able to vote. Well, why? Why you and why not them, right? So you can maybe play on that theme for a little bit and see where it goes.
That was great. Thank you. I took notes, by the way.
Good.
And
Okay.
I guess I'm gonna have to apologize for last year.
No.
Good for
That's
you,
fine.
Andrea. Okay,
Yeah.
Dawn. I'm sorry, go
I-
ahead.
We'll hear Don, and yeah, but I referenced the Car Talk guys earlier, but with the same tagline can apply here. If you follow any of my advice here today and it works, let me know. If it doesn't, well.
I love Car
right.
Talk guys too. I miss them.
Dawn.
All right, Dawn.
Well, it's been very informational. Thank you. To listen, and especially I like the although I asked the question to my parents and my sisters over the last year or so. I think can you send that? Can you post those questions? I don't think were they on the slide. They weren't on the slide, were they?
No, I can post them.
Okay. I have tried the approach of seek first to understand, and I think that my challenge is being frustrated with their willful ignorance. So I think those questions might be helpful if the time is right. Once I know where they're coming from and I know why they think the way they do, and I try to understand that. The COVID thing and the election and the vaccine, a lot of stuff lately is tying back to Trump, especially in regard to the Vietnamese community. The majority of the Vietnamese community, I believe, especially the older generation, as in my parents' generation, those who had to fled Vietnam because of the war, they hold a certain belief that it makes them to be a devout followers of Trump, whatever Trump spreads. And so it's kind of sad, ironic and sad that my dad being, and a lot of, not just my dad, there's people in my families, immediate families, who are anti-immigration. So as much as I try to understand where they're coming from, I'm still having, as much as I understand where they're coming from, I'm still having trouble getting into conversation with them. It's one thing to get in a conversation with, on Nextdoor app with, neighbors or people in the community who I've never met, basically are strangers. But it is something else when it's within the family, because I get to face it more and it doesn't go away. Unlike, somebody on the Nextdoor app. And so I guess I'm looking for other ways to approach the conversation with people like in my immediate family, given their background, the culture, because in Asian culture, because they are older, my parents and my aunts and uncles, because they older, it is given that they are wiser. So that's something else is that I can't get past that. I can't just say, this is logic, this is reason, this is what I read. It does not matter, because the information coming from me is not as valid, valuable, or any good compared to coming from my dad, aunts, and uncles. So I'm not just challenge. I'm not. The challenge is not just dealing with ignorant people, but people who are willfully ignorant because of one reason or the other. And in regard, I want to respond to somebody who was saying something about volunteering at, helping out, partnering up with religious communities, organizations to do Um, having volunteer at the Buddhist temple, I can understand that they don't want non-religious folk to join. I think to me, from what I've seen, is as though if you have a group of enlightened people and you have somebody else who you deem unenlightened join the group, you wouldn't want that person to be involved with your group or coming anywhere near your group. So that's one way I see it. So it's very challenging to partner with a religious group for that reason. They don't want that religious reason aside. Having known the monk at the local temple, I can see from his perspective, he would say, this are the folks that are coming here for community and all kind of sort of stuff, and they don't want to be made uncomfortable because you're questioning them one way or the other. Now, I know a lot of you are being logical and reasonable, and you're not going to like slam them because of their, lack of whatever. But there's always a fear of that. So
Thank you, Dawn. I think
that's my.
Go ahead. No. I think that's very helpful for us to keep in mind when we're approaching people. And I think we've also learned a lot from Dr. Bryer on how to approach people better. Chris, you have your question.
I just want to talk, it's talking about religious groups shutting down. I spent a year with the Jehovah's Witnesses. They came into my backyard and said, hey, would you like to talk? And I said, as long as you understand you're not going to change my opinion, I'm not going to change yours. You don't get mad, let's talk. And we went for a year. And, it's not that they shut me down. Of course, they didn't listen to me any more than I listened to them. But they get their God points by talking. Now, I can't talk to other religious groups and how they feel. But you also have to understand we as atheists are a direct threat to them. Because as it is, they're losing members left and right. And we are at the forefront, the face of it. So I can understand why they would tend not to want to deal with us, because it's dealing with their mortal enemy, basically. I mean, let's not forget, religion is not rational, just like most of the Republican Party at the moment, and their beliefs are not rational. If you're talking about, whether or not the elections have been rigged, there is a mound of evidence as high as Mount Everest that they weren't. I mean, they recounted Georgia by hand 3 freaking times, and you still went ahead and did that. You cannot cure irrational fears by rational argument.
No, you can't.
They've already seen all this stuff. They've already discounted everything you're going to tell them. I don't know what to tell you. If you really think you can get to change somebody's opinion like that, be my guest, but it'll never happen. Hasn't happened to me in 30 years of arguing with them over things. No matter what you say, no matter you literally can say, look, there's the sun, it's setting. In what direction is it setting? The west. What direction is the sun setting? The north. That's my conversations with them. So I don't know what else to tell you, except lots of luck if you're going to think you're going to change any of that, especially when you get to be my age at 73 and you're talking to other 73-year-olds, people in there who have been through this exact same experience that you have and come to a conclusion that's totally different.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Dr. Bryer, did you want to address anything in that?
I agree. Changing someone's position is really not the purpose of conversations like this. Even with the vaccine conversations that I'm conducting right now, the intent is not to change minds. It is to understand, and then through that understanding, maybe assist those with the power of messaging and mass communication or individual communication, messaging content that can make somebody feel more comfortable getting the vaccine in the interest of public health. But these conversations are never based around changing minds. They're always starting with developing an understanding. And with that, then we're not yelling at each other. We're not demonizing each other. We're moving, even if we disagree, we're in more complete understanding. The worst thing that can happen, though, is for folks to throw up their hands after battling back and forth for an hour, a day, a week, a year, or 10 years to say, let's just agree to disagree. That's the worst possible thing somebody can say in these conversations, because then we're walking away and we're divided, and we're saying, you know, I don't want to talk to that person again because they're just a curmudgeon and whatever. So we're gonna want to avoid that kind of outcome.
You know, I've always thought that we have more in common with each other than we have differences. It's just how do we get people to see that? Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I can remember most I was going to say now.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good points. You know, I just had a conversation with one of my students who, in answer to one of my questions, she's like, well, who's to say this isn't the case? And, you know, I had to tell her, well, we're to say. Anyway, that was my point. My point was that you have to understand the difference between a conversation and an argument. And I think that's where a lot of this stuff breaks down, is that a lot of people equate conversations with arguments, and that arguments and conversations are the same things, which they are not. There's this very influential book that came out, I think in the mid-90s maybe, by Deborah Tannen, called The Argument Culture, in which she talks about how in our culture we've sort of become primed through things like, you know, the 24-hour news cycle, where instead of debating issues, we've sort of gotten to this point where we're just trying to win an argument in the opposition. And, you know, that's not really all that fruitful. I mean, you know, you're just starting out with a point that I have this position and I want to bludgeon someone over the head until they have the same position that I have. I mean, that's not a conversation, that's an argument. So, you know, I think that's the one thing that when we are engaging with people, that, you know, especially with these difficult topics, we have to somehow make it clear that, you know, we're not coming at this from an argumentative position, we're coming at this from discussing the issues. I mean, I just came from right before this, I had another meeting that was, you know, another very non-controversial topic of whether God exists. And there was this one Muslim guy who his position was just that, this is what I believe. I don't respect your opinion. I don't respect what you have to say. I only respect what I have to say. And I have to get my opinion out there, whether you like it or not. And that, you know, is the wrong way to approach it. Anyway, I think that's the gist of most of what I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. I think I may have accidentally lowered somebody's hand. So if you had your hand up and you don't see it up now, please let me know, because I think I did that. Otherwise, Bill Northworthy.
Okay, thank you. From my experience in talking to people about controversial issues, it's become very obvious to me that the most essential thing you have to have with the person you're talking with is trust. And it takes a long time to develop that level of trust to get into a very controversial, gut-wrenching issue, even to discuss it without evoking the fear response and getting a lot of emotion ginned up in a hurry. If somebody doesn't trust you, then they are going into defensive mode almost immediately, and the discussion is really over. So that is not a productive way to persuade people to change anything, especially a very controversial issue. So that issue of trust is very important, it seems to me, and I'd be interested, Dr. Bryer, to know your perspective on that issue.
Yeah, I agree. You either need experience working with that person or communicating with that person. Whether that equates to trust, maybe, maybe not. Trust is kind of a tricky concept, but experience. So you get to know each other. You know if someone is is off. If you know if someone is having a bad day and that's why they're acting negatively, or you know, so experience talking with someone is critical to communicate effectively with them on these tough issues. So you either need that experience for one-on-one dialogue, or you need a good facilitator if you're going at it for the first time without that experience. But I agree, absolutely. I'm not sure I would use the word trust as such, but experience.
Well, if I could just elaborate on that point, the idea of trust that I'm talking about is that you are not going to try to destroy them.
Yeah.
They can trust that you are going to be a fair player in the game.
Right.
And that's that's my definition of trust here.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Bill. Joe Reinhardt, I think you had your hand up earlier, and I think that you may be the one that I accidentally shut down.
Oh, well, it's become a rather moot point by now,
Okay.
so I'll yield my time.
Okay. We did, there are some questions in the chat, but it is 6:30 and that's our usual ending time, but and that's the time I told you, so I don't want to take your time if you need to leave and whatever. But I do have one more question that I would like to clarify on, and that's about when you talk about the geography. Could you explain that a little more?
Sure. My point there was to say that when we enter into these conversations with people where we don't have that experience, or that they are, for all intents and purposes, strangers to us, that we start not from a foundation of shared values, because that's tricky, and we might get to unshared values or different values pretty quickly, which would be complicating for the relationship. But to start with a shared geography instead, just a simple recognition that that if we want our community, if we want the Tampa Bay region to be successful economically, socially, politically, safety, whatever, any measure you want for the success of an area, start with the foundation that we live together, and what do we see as the big questions of what are the visions for, how do you envision this community in the future, focusing on the geography, on place-based rather than values-based. If we can collectively talk about why we would value more green space or more parks for our kids, or more after-school activities to keep kids off the streets after school hours, these are things that we can share without getting into some difficult issues that divide us right away. We can say, I drive home at night and I feel unsafe because we don't have adequate street lighting, or going through this neighborhood after a certain hour concerns me, or name your issue, whatever quality of life issue is in the place. It starts the conversation on a shared experience of living in the same general area, and from there you can advance to the other issues that will be more complicated. But it maybe is consistent with Bill's point, which is start to build that trust with each other, that you're not going to throw each other under the bus or try to push each other in front of the bus, by talking about quality of life issues that you can all relate to, that you can all see, feel, touch, and smell, and move from there.
Michael, did you have something else? I know you had your
I was
hand
going to
up.
ask the exact same question, actually.
Okay. There are, one of the concerns I have is we have some very urgent issues. The white supremacy situation in this country is appalling. And I know that what we're talking about is a long-term kind of solution, but do you have any kind of hints as to how we can deal with these urgent issues?
Yeah, so the right-wing extremism, the white supremacist organizations, these domestic terror organizations, all of these are of significant concern, and that these are not things that we talk through and solve with them, right? You know, we're not going to get anywhere by necessarily sitting down with the group of white supremacists. Though there are stories of people who have sort of done that and changed perspectives and developed relationships, and so there is some person by person possibility that something like that can happen. But in the immediacy of where we are now, there is. You know, these are not questions as much for a dialogue with those who are part of those groups. There is important dialogue that can occur, though, with everybody who is not a part of those groups, and that's something that many of our organizations can relate to. You know, there might be some religious faith organizations that have a set of value systems that suggest discrimination against those who are gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, or other gender identity. There might be some racist elements in all organizations, which was part of my topic for these discussions last semester with my students. This idea from Ibram Kendi in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist. His central thesis is that every law in our country and around the world is either racist or anti-racist. There's no in between. And so the question is, how do we identify where those racist policies are and change them? So there is opportunity for dialogue across organizations now about how to deal with these extreme elements of society. And part of that conversation does include the real efforts of law enforcement, of states attorneys and U.S. attorneys and others. But I won't be naive to say that you know, there's an open table for those of the majority to sit down with those who are extremists. That's not a viable short-term or long-term strategy necessarily.
Right. Yeah, it seems to me this is an opportunity because it's up to all of us who are in that extremist group to help promote other groups that are hesitant to get involved in things like this, to stand up and speak out. And that's kind of part of why I wanted you here, so that I could learn personally, and hopefully the group could too, on how we can approach people who are not on that extreme edge at this point, but are standing back and not doing anything about what's going on. We have to stand up and do something about it. And we can do that better by coming together, I think.
Yes.
Than by fighting each other over whether or not the Bible is true. It doesn't matter if we can work on this issue, we can stop this kind of racist move we have towards fascism in this country, in my opinion.
Right.
Okay, so I will give you the floor for your closing comments, if you have any.
Well, that was a brilliant way to end, Judy. So that's. But I'll say I typed my email address into the chat box, so I welcome anybody to send me a note if you want to share any additional thoughts or ask additional questions. I can't promise I can hop on a Zoom or a phone call on a regular basis, but if there are folks who want to join back for some further conversation, I'm always happy. I've enjoyed this, actually. I've done versions of it since I published that op-ed in the Sentinel. I've given, I think, 5 or 6 conversations invited by different groups, which says to me that there's an appetite for engaging in these dialogues. that's a good thing. I see a lot of hope in that.
We just have to find each other.
You just have to find each other. And, I'm recognizing the sort of leverage power that I might have to say, hey, these groups have all invited me to give talks. I've given talks. Maybe we can all have a
That's
little
a great
symposium
idea.
to talk about
Yeah, that would
how
be
we work
wonderful.
together.
Yeah.
So, but with that, so truly thank you. This has been a lot of fun, a lot of interesting. I loved your
Thank you.
questions, very difficult questions, as they should be. And you're welcome to join my vaccine conversations if you're
Yes.
interested.
Could you put that link in the chat so I can make sure I get a copy of that to put out for people?
Sure.
And I do want to thank you. I know that this must have been somewhat difficult since we are adamantly anti-religion, and you are religious, so that's you were quite patient with us for calling it out for what we think it is, and I appreciate your time very much.
No,
Thank
it's my
you.
pleasure. Thank you so much. Stay well.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Glad you got your shot.
Thank you.
If
Bye,
there's
everyone.
any-